Hello, this is Craig Resnick, coming to you from the 30th Annual ARC Advisory Group Orlando Forum. I want to welcome today my special guest, Chris Huff, who's the CEO of Adlib Software. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, appreciate it. Nice to be here, Craig.
And thank you so much for coming. We've really great to have you. And you know, I'm going to talk about a subject that we always try to have it say, can we ever finish a sentence without saying AI and somehow involved in the sentence? We know it's everywhere. Well, you know, most industrial programs, those kind of stall because of what we might call messy inputs. You know, what have you shipped recently to help manufacturers, you know, operationalize, you know, AI safety, you know, like turning unstructured documents into trusted, auditable inputs for automation and copilots?
Greg, you're absolutely right, and that is one of the key points that we're hearing over and over again at this conference. So what we do at Adlib is basically we are the accuracy layer for the manufacturers. So think of us as setting in front of all of the manufacturers' core systems, whether it's a PLM, QMS, but all of that messy, complex document needs to be turned into trusted data products before it goes into their systems. And so that's where we set in as the accuracy layer.
You know, because when you talk about like quantify, like trust, you know, like accuracy, confidence, traceability before content hits downstream AI, and how does that fit into like existing stacks without doing like a rip and replace?
So think of it as a sidecar. So it's riding alongside the applications. It's not ripping and replacing. It's not replacing them in terms of a transitional phase. It is truly augmenting them from day one. So that way our customers at the end of the day can trust the outputs of their PLMSs. And that's where we see sort of a lot of these projects that are in experimental phase struggling to scale is because they don't quite trust the outputs. And it's largely because the inputs are these complex, messy documents that need to be turned into data products, so that way the PLMS can actually do its job.
You know, it's interesting. You know, at the same time when where AI is so prevalent, obviously issues of the workforce are so prevalent and huge challenges, whether it be due to, you know, retirements, positions eliminated due to technology or cost. What do you see as kind of the biggest human tax in document and heavy manufacturing workflows, and how do you reduce it without increasing risk?
I would say one of the biggest taxes for the organization and the individual, and these are knowledge workers that we're talking about. These are QA specialists, they're engineers. The biggest tax is that they are having to stare at documents and compare those documents to regulatory compliance-oriented operating procedures to ensure that they can pass audits. That should all be automated and can be automated. And I think that's where a lack of investment currently sits today. A lot of the analysts will tell you that companies are buying AI and setting it downstream, but what they're not focused on is sort of pre-downstream, which are the documents that are coming in. So we focus on the ingest portion of it. And at that point, we're able to normalize the data, extract the data, and then enrich it so that way, again, it can go into the manufacturer's core systems. And that's where we begin to automate some of the lower value work that these engineers and QA specialists are handling today.
Because you think about like what gets automated, say end-to-end versus where is the human in the loop and why, and what metrics do you recommend tracking, you know, like exception rate or cycle time, you know, validation pass rate, you know, prep time?
Sure, things vary, but what I would say is the end-to-end automation, largely a lot of a process is defined through an operating procedure, an SOP, a standard operating procedure. That should be standardized, and with technology today, like the Adlib accuracy layer that we bring in our Transform platform, you can absolutely do that end to end. Where the human sets in is where there's an exception. Where true, if you're thinking of that transactional to sort of knowledge worker spectrum, where knowledge worker really needs to set in and adjudicate or make a decision on something, those are typically the exceptions. But the happy path, as they call it, the validation rules, that should all be handled by and can be handled by automation and AI.
Another certainly hot topic at this forum is certainly digital twin and simulations, but we all know they're only as reliable as the engineering artifacts that feeding them. There'd be P&ID drawings, inspection reports, standard operating procedures. How do you help manufacturers and processes standardize and validate those documents so digital twins and analytics don't run on guesswork?
So you're absolutely right. The digital twin is critical because that digital twin should be and needs to be an exact replica of the production environment. What we do at Adlib is we've got a value chain that we put on that front end to ensure that the digital twin is an exact replica of that production environment. And what that really looks like is we will ingest and normalize 300 plus different file types, everything from 3D CAD drawings to basic PDFs. So very complicated to run-of-the-day mill things. So we will normalize all those files. We will extract the data, and at that point, it's a true data product, machine-readable ones and zeros. At that point, we can enrich the data based on metadata tags that maybe need to be applied to, and that will then go into the pre-prod environment, or the digital twin in this instance, and that's when testing can be done. That's when outputs of the systems within the twin can be trusted.
Mm-hmm. We all know that manufacturers are, leveraging AI and advanced analytics, to sort through that endless amount of data, converting that data into actionable information and co-pilots. A lot of co-pilots fail, though, because the answers can't be traced back to sources. How do you enable co-pilots or even, retrieval augmented generation, agentic workflows that are grounded in verified documents and defensible for quality assurance, safety, and compliance?
Another key area that is often overlooked, so what we've talked about up to this point is a lot of the pre-processing, so ingesting the data, normalizing it, standardizing, and then enriching where needed, and then putting it into a core manufacturer's system. What we also have within the Adlib accuracy layer and the transform platform is post-processing. What post-processing means is all of the data that is now coming out of the PLM or the QMS, it can now be traced back to, so think lineage, chain of custody. So all of the outputs that previously without Adlib, our customers were questioning the validity of the data, now they can actually trace the data back. So we'll call that provenance, so who touched it, what did they do with it, when did they do it, and then the auditability back to the source document. That's what gives the co-pilots, whether it's retrieval augmented generation, RAG, or co-pilots, or any AI application or system, but the outputs now can be traced back to source documentation, and this is what allows our customers to pass their audits.
Yeah, and how do you do reduce hallucinations, pre-processing, extraction, and validation, and retrieval citations, and do customers bring their own model, let's say, so sovereignty? How do you keep the workflows consistent across models?
Yeah, so that is a big thing, because for the first time, what we're seeing is AI is being pushed from the top down. Most innovation waves are typically a bottom up or sort of from the middle and radiates out. But boards and CEOs that I'm engaged with across the board are pushing AI. And so middle managers or line of business leaders are confronted with this, okay, let's buy the AI and let's apply it. But that typically, again, is very upstream. And so they miss the downstream. And that's the ingesting of the data, the original document sources. So what we'll do, that I was alluding to earlier, is that value chain around normalizing, validating, and then getting into the provenance and the auditability. And that's what allows these co-pilots to be trusted.
Mm-hmm. If we're looking at 2026, what are the two biggest risks that you see for manufacturers and processes as they trying to scale AI? And what practical steps should they take in the next 90 days to avoid stalled pilots and compliance surprises?
A couple key things that we're already seeing trending in 26, already a couple months into it. It's crazy how time flies. But a couple of areas is there's a huge governance gap right now, which means that there is a lot of untrusted, unverified data that is flowing through manufacturing systems. That's a big governance gap. And again, the investment that we're seeing that's being put upstream because of the top-down push on this needs to sort of find its way to downstream, meaning where is the data first coming in? What is the source of truth? I think another area is we really need to take a first principles approach to how we're deploying AI to get from this experimental phase that most manufacturers seem to be stuck in to scaling it. And what I mean by that is a first principles approach is just constantly asking why to a rather complex question, as opposed to on the surface taking it for granted. And I think when you start to ask why, you'll get down to, oh, we need to be able to trust the original inputs that are coming in, because there's no way we're going to be able to get to an output trusted, verified environment. And I think that at the end of the day leads many of our customers to say, we need to develop an accuracy layer. And then it's what is that and who can help us with that? And that's where we partner with a tremendous amount of the customers that we see here at this conference.
Yeah, because I look at what does AI ready actually mean in industrial settings? Data contracts, validation rules, exception paths, audit trails, and where do you expect the biggest pressure? Interoperability, governance, regulatory scrutiny, or skill gaps?
So I would say that AI ready means that you're taking complex documents and turning them into trusted data products. Once it's a trusted data product, it's machine readable ones and O's. It's basically truth at that point, and then you can flow it through your systems. You can perform analytics on it. You can perform decision making on it. You can make strategy and drive execution. What I do see in terms of a gap moving forward that I think does need to be filled down on pretty quickly is there is the technology coming in, and then there's the workforce and the enablement of the workforce. I think a lot of the workers today are questioning, what's my role in the go-forward organization with all of this innovation coming in? So I do think that it's not just, are we adopting the technology, but I think there is an onus on the organization around how are we enabling the workforce to adopt and scale this, because it is not, I've been through several of these innovation waves. It is going to change the composition of the workforce, so different skills will be needed. Yep. At the end of the day, there are always more jobs through every innovation wave to date. At the end of the day, there is always greater productivity with more jobs. And so it's determining how do we take the current workforce and transition them to this future.
How do we make them better and more productive and even more relevant?
That's a very key point, and the more relevancy I think comes through including them in the solution, not throwing a solution on them. So the most successful implementations that we see, so going from experimental to scale, in the fastest way possible, is by including the workforce. And a lot of that is they know their process in terms of how the work is to be done better than anybody else. And so taking that knowledge and basically baking it into how the software needs to come into the organization, that at the end of the day I think is the secret sauce.
Yeah, and I think certainly Adlib software is in a great position to be certainly providing those solutions. So
we're seeing a good tailwind because I think AI, just like to an organization, same thing to a software company that's been around for 25 years, can absolutely serve as a headwind. Turning it into a tailwind needs to be done very methodically, and I think that's what we've done by basically taking our bread and butter, which has always been around understanding complex data. And now, why does that matter in the era of AI? It's because AI, as it's implemented on its own today, there's some still distrust because of the hallucinations that we all hear about. And so being able to serve as that accuracy layer on the front end to really make sense of that complex data, that's serving as a tremendous tailwind for us and our customers.
Yeah, I think that's great. We look forward to watching your progress throughout the year and seeing you next year at the next ARC forum. But thanks, Chris Huff, CEO of Adlib Software. Thanks so much for being here today.
No, appreciate it, Craig. Thanks for having me.
This is Craig Resnick coming to you from the 30th Annual ARC Advisory Group Orlando Forum. I want to thank you very much for listening. Have a great day. Thank you so much.